I love the liveliness, the constant feeling of energy.
Definitely the world-class education.
The diversity. Nah, the nightlife.
I would say the people.
For me, it's the stories. My name is Waja, and welcome to Toronto Story Archive. Hello, and welcome to the premiere episode of Toronto Story Archive. Look, I'm just gonna out and say it. I love this city. Many people say that a person or an experience changed their life. For me, it was a place. It was Toronto. I first moved to Toronto in 2008, fresh from North Bay, Ontario. For those of you who don't know the gateway to the north, that's an ambitious 3 or a casual 4-hour drive north of Toronto. At the time, I had just been accepted to U of T, and I was excited. Excited to be getting out of my comfort zone, excited to meet new people, excited to explore a new city. Now, exploring. That's where this story starts. I'm 2 months into my first semester at U of T, and at this time, I feel like I've got a handle on things. Google Maps has become my best friend. I've mastered the subway system well enough not to need the map, but not so well, not so comfortably that I'm quite ready to stand on the yellow line. That afternoon, I'd managed to swing a rendezvous with a lovely lady, and so it was that I found myself standing a good half-hour early at St. Patrick's Station. Now, the lady in question was more familiar with Toronto than I, but being young, urbane, and armed with Google Maps, I insisted that I would choose the restaurant. That restaurant was Cora's, and no, not the easy Cora's on Yonge and College. I'm talking the Mission Cora's, the one way down near Front Street. Now, this is where Google Maps becomes important. You see, in all my explorations, I had never actually been to this Cora's. I was going off of a combination of the advice of a friend, who shall remain nameless, and the information Google had given me. To put today in perspective, the day in question was dreary as hell. Wet, cold rain interspersed with sleet and sideways covered in slush. Nothing like the balmy winter we've been experiencing so far this year. The moment we got outside, she asked where we were going. Being particularly suave and not quite realizing the distance, I told her, "Don't worry about it, we'll be there soon." Little did I know that would definitely not be the case. You see, on a good day, the 10 to 15 minute walk to Cora's from St. Patrick's wouldn't have been bad. It actually would have been quite welcome, a chance for us to get to know each other better. But with the wind kicking up, rendering my umbrella useless almost immediately, which should have been a quick conversational jaunt, became a trek done in grim silence. Both of us leaning forward against the wind, her hair whipping up around both of our heads, and us shielding our faces with our hands against the rain and sleet. Yet see, I had hope. The entire way I consoled myself that once we got to Cora's, it would be warm, there would be some eggs Benny, and then I'd be able to turn on the Waja charm and all would be well with the world. It was not. You see, the trouble with not visiting a place before you invite another person there is you have no actual evidence that that place really exists. Because you see, when at last we arrived at that dot on Google Maps, that blessed dot telling me you have arrived at your destination, and I looked up, expecting to see the happy sun of Cora's in front of me, and with it, the promise of warmth, conversation, and food, I instead saw the gray of a construction site. Well, the gray and the white of all the snow and all the slush, covering the crater where that Cora's used to be. Now, since that point, I've been luckier in love. I'm happily engaged now. Everywhere I've tried to take Sarah was still standing. That was definitely a plus. But this podcast isn't all about me. To kick off the premiere of Toronto Story Archive, I want to welcome a man whose explorations and pursuit of love and happiness has taken him around the world, who now, once again, calls Toronto his home. It is my great pleasure to chat today with fellow podcaster Datanga Small. Datanga is a customer experience specialist and the host of the Small World podcast. Coming at us from Toronto's York region, welcome Datanga.
Thank you so much for having me, Mo.
Datanga, I have to ask you the one major question we ask every single person who comes on Toronto Story Archive, and that is, what is one thing you love about Toronto?
It's an interesting question because with Toronto, Toronto is a relatively young city compared to other cities around the world. So Toronto was actually started in 1834, I believe. So Toronto's sort of finding its identity still. And because of that, the people within the city and people who are active in politics and within creating businesses and things like that have a lot of a say of the direction in which Toronto goes. So that's what I like about it. As a person born and raised here, if I were so inclined, I could actually start a business in the middle of downtown Toronto, and I could be part of the Toronto experience and culture that other people from around the world could then come and see.
So you're fairly well traveled, though. I mean, I think you've been to what, 20 or lived in about 20 countries so far. How have you found that kind of, I guess, directed experience here in Toronto compared to, I don't know, for instance, Paris or Belgium or one of the other places that you either been to or lived in the past?
So it's interesting because other cities have a much more deep history. You brought up the idea of Paris, for example. I mean, we all know from like the World Wars that the city has been destroyed and rebuilt. With Belgium, it's the head of, or it contains the head of the European Union, which is controversial because it's under scrutiny sometimes, and some people love it. So the main difference is that with those cities, I feel like they've established who they are, and it sort of comes off it's kind of a weird way of saying it, but it sort of comes off in a vibe that you feel throughout the city. Another example I'd want to give about this is Berlin, because Berlin is probably one of the most liberal, sort of, I guess, in layman's terms, hipster places in Germany. And the reason for that is because there was such a retribution against the split of East and West Berlin. So it's sort of interesting that you mentioned that because all of these cities around the world have their own history, and because of that, their culture is so, I guess, obvious. And with Toronto, it's a bit different. So for somebody to emigrate here, they might not feel exactly what Toronto is at first, but as you grow older and you start giving more to the city in terms of your contributions, either towards tax dollars or your capitalist contributions and things like that, then what happens is you start to feel more at home because you are building a part of that home instead of being part of something that was already built before you.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I've seen that a bit myself. I'm not quite so well traveled as yourself, but there's always been kind of this seam that exists that I saw when I was in Paris, for example, or even when I was traveling to Morocco, where there's this area, this region of space where the old world and things that have been established meet kind of the new and up and coming elements of the city. One of the places that I saw this the most was when I was traveling in India. You had all the modern aspects of the world on one side, which is where people are still building and growing, and then you would go to one of the villages, or you would go to one of the older regions of Bombay, for instance, or Goa, and it would be just like going right back into the past, into a thing that had already been established and built and was kind of unchanging in a way at that point.
And that's exactly it. That's the whole thing. Even when you consider new like infrastructure projects and things like that that take place within these cities and countries, there's always sort of a hint of what used to be because it's hard to let go of that. It's not like I like to actually compare Toronto to a place like Singapore. Singapore was sort of created out of nothing, I suppose, a few decades ago. And, the government there put in a bunch of money and they built it to be like a financial hub in Asia. And so what happened there was that the city is successful in many ways. Lots of law and order there. It makes a lot of money. They achieved its goal of being a financial center. But it's sort of missing that culture, like that history of what makes Singapore, right? And so I find the same thing happens with Toronto, funny enough. But the difference is, we both live in Toronto, so we could see it. Whenever we walk around, we always see something new being built. It's either a condominium or new streetcars or things like that. All these things are just built over and over, and they keep on growing and growing. And while there's growing pains, like with any other city, you're starting to see some sort of established history from Toronto that is contagious, really. And you're even starting to see it in like regular media. You look at uh, Drake. He's a great example. Like he reps Toronto because it's kind of becoming more cool to be from Toronto, right? And that's because we're starting to establish some sort of culture here that is expanding either towards like, directly outside of us, or we're finally starting to grow out of the shadow of our southern neighbors and their big cities.
So where do you think the point will become where we stop being, a new up and coming city that's building new things constantly throughout the city and reach that point of one of, our older European neighbors across the pond, as it were, where they have that distinct history, where there are elements that are just, unchanging. Because I think we've seen even recently in the Bloor Young area, we've seen historical buildings that are actually being repurposed into newer, more modern buildings rather than being left in their current state. So when do you think we'll reach that, or will we reach that point?
And that's a good question. And that's the entire point, I suppose, is that there is sort of a crossroads of sorts. On one side, personally, I mean, let's talk about like Honest Ed's, for example. That was unfortunately they basically went out of business because they just couldn't offer the value that they used to, and so capitalism worked. They went out of business, but it's sort of funny because Honest Ed's had this sort of this effect on Toronto, or this historical effect where they were at one point the center for immigrants who recently came to Toronto to buy cheap things, and it was their way of surviving. And so there's historical significance there. And what's kind of unfortunate in that case is that there's not much really being done with it besides keeping the sign. But I don't believe anyone in the future is really going to understand its historical significance. So this is kind of why I'm going back to what I was saying about us having the ability to make contributions to the city. Because I used to be on the sidelines where I was just complaining about, the history is being destroyed and the Toronto doesn't have culture and whatever. But then I realized, like, I'm part of Toronto. I have the ability to be part of that change and offer some sort of culture. And we don't have to be a clone of, like, New York City, for example, which I find a fair amount of people that I speak to, at least, want Toronto to be. So we do have the ability to influence it. But you're right. The question is, will it happen? And it's kind of funny because it kind of goes back to the whole conversation about Drake and stuff. And not even just Drake, but like even more like other culture, like having the All-Star game happen in Toronto and things like that. Toronto's starting to be put on the map, and that's a good thing. But I feel like it's sort of putting the cart before the horse, because you're being put on the map, but you don't know what you're being put on the map for. So it's a good question. I mean, I think it'll start happening once we start sort of getting that media traction from musical artists and from events taking place here. Having the Olympics here maybe at some point in the future. But we also need to establish sort of what Toronto's history was. Like New York's was like a hub for immigrants from basically the Second World War, and even before that, to live in like a sort of oasis, a multicultural, multi-ethnic oasis. And I think Toronto has similar historical. I guess Toronto has a history somewhat like that, but it's not as well established because number one, we don't really talk about it. Number two, Toronto's not really in pop culture until recently, at least. So it's going to take time, but I think it'll happen once we start getting into pop culture more, and then hopefully we'll start understanding exactly what, as a community, we want Toronto to be.
I mean, I guess it's not just being part of the change, it's being a driver of change within our community and within Toronto, especially as we, continue to expand and explore and push the borders and hit that international stage.
Exactly. Like, it's sort of funny when I hear people say that like Toronto's like is a world-class city and things like that. But the truth is, the definition of a world-class city is is up in the air. What does that really mean, right? We have five-star restaurants, sure, but what does that mean? We have one of the tallest, I believe the tallest freestanding structure in North America. That's cool, but what does that mean? When you look at all these things and you put them together, um, you have to ask yourself, what does that mean, right? And it's once again, I really do think it comes back down to pop culture too, because look at New York is so interesting, and I keep on bringing up this example because New York is everywhere. Any single TV show that you watch will mention some part of New York, or the main character will be based in New York, and because of that, when you actually visit New York, you already have a preconceived notion of what the city's supposed to be like. Like I remember I was watching a Daredevil, right? And they were talking about Hell's Kitchen. I was thinking to myself, I was like, Hell's Kitchen, like that's such a stupid name. That can't possibly exist. But when I went to New York City, there actually is an area called Hell's Kitchen, and it contains some of the best restaurants in the city. So like, it's the stuff that I see and the stuff that I sort of experience and how I thought it would be versus what I actually see. And with Toronto, like no one's planning to shoot a movie in Toronto unless they're looking to change the taxi cab that we have here from the orange ones to the yellow ones that you see in New York because it's cheaper to film in Toronto than New York. So one thing that we have to work on is establishing why Toronto is, number one, a good place to film. Number two, how many people actually come from Toronto and the surrounding areas, like Drake, The Weeknd. I know Justin Bieber's not from Toronto specifically, but he's from Orangeville, which is also in Ontario, which is a surrounding area. And really being proud of that and showcasing that. And I think that somebody like Drake is doing a good job of really representing Toronto, but we need more of that if we want to become a city that is, I believe, considered world-class.
For sure. I mean, the filming thing is interesting. There's a show I watch, Orphan Black, and Orphan Black is, I believe, almost completely filmed in Toronto, but they never mention the city. I don't think they ever actually mention the location where the main story takes place at all. It's a strong place to film, but you know, even one of the old Hulks, I think the one with Edward Norton, was filmed around U of T, but it's still pitched as being from the United States. But okay, let's talk about the people for a bit. I mean, you're, as you said, well-traveled, 20 different countries. So what have you found the difference between, I guess, kind of the population of Toronto, the people we see here versus the people you see around the world? And I know that's a very broad question, so I don't know, maybe choose a couple of places.
Yeah, so, okay. So it's sort of interesting because I don't really believe that people are so different within different places. I mean, obviously they have cultural differences, and those are reflected in the way that they act up to a certain extent. But there's a few things that I believe influence the way people act and the way you feel about the people that you interact with. And it has less to do with the people and more to do with the weather, which is funny because it's funny with Toronto, and you could probably share this experience, and I think many people in Toronto can share this, is that in the winter, it is hard. It is hard to be the social person that you want to be if you are, right? Because the sun is not out, it's cloudy, it's cold, you don't want to go outside, and you're just thinking to yourself, well, at least I am. I'm thinking like, I just want to go and then go home. I just want to go to where I'm going and come back. And like, there's not even many places in Toronto to participate in winter sports like snowboarding and skiing and things like that. You have to go outside of the city in order to really reach to be able to participate in those sports fully. So in the winter, I'm not the biggest fan of Toronto, but when the summer comes and the sun is out and the heat is nice, what you find is that everybody is just happier. There's a lot more events. There's a lot more friendly people smiling at you, a lot more parties. Just the sun is out for longer. It's almost like a complete 180. And the reason I mention that with Toronto is because when you look at other cities and the way you compare them, I used to live in Sweden, and Sweden has very similar issues. with the lack of sun, even more than Toronto, because there's where I lived was more north, and so there were points when I lived in Sweden where the sun would only be out from like 11 a.m. till 3 p.m. And so during the winter when I was there, it was kind of tiring, right? Because you don't get the vitamin D, you don't get a lot of sun. No one really wants to go out and do things. And the only reason I did was because I was like an international student who was experiencing it for the first time. So so then you go from there and then you go to a place like southern Spain, which is just it's one of the happiest places I've ever been to. Everyone is so full of joy. And it's hard to disconnect the two things that I mentioned. It's hard to disconnect the mood of the people there and the fact that the sun is there all the time, and it's almost always hot. And there's like literally no snow ever, except maybe once like every 6 years. So the difference between the people really comes down to the time that you visit. I think if anybody from abroad visited Toronto when it is summer, people would have the best impression of the city ever. No one would leave upset or anything because everyone's super kind. We do truly live up to our Canadian stereotype. People are super kind. They're super open. But if you visited here in like, I don't know, January, unless you have a good reason, I don't see a reason to do that personally. So it's kind of interesting that you mentioned that because I think it's totally based on weather patterns.
See, I keep trying to explain this to all my cousins in South Africa, yet they insist on coming during the winter. They're like, no, we want to see snow. We want to see snow. And I'm like, man, you don't want to see snow. I guarantee you that this snow thing, it's going to lose its novelty in a day. And then it's just going to be cold and unpleasant. And nobody's going to want to deal with you. And you're not going to want to deal with anybody else.
Yeah, and that's the thing. And the thing is, I'm not against snow really. I'm against snow in a big city because it's not friendly. Like, you know what I mean? If you go to Blue Mountain or something, then the snow you can just pick up from the ground, toss. You know, you could do all the winter sports I was mentioning. But here, like this snow is just it's dirty because of like. I could rant on this for days, but I don't want to take up all your time on that.
I mean, it doesn't do anything. It doesn't do anything. It's just there, and it's kind of in the way.
Exactly. It just slows things down.
Absolutely. Okay. So now you've been experiencing these people. You've seen the difference in the weather from one place to another and how it's affected the mood of people around you. So what about relationship building from Toronto to abroad, and now you're back in Toronto again? And I mean, this is kind of a leading question because we're coming down to the crux of the story that you're going to be telling us today on Toronto Story Archive. So I guess maybe use this as an opportunity to talk a bit about the relationships you had abroad, the relationships you've had here, and I mean, bring us to that story.
For sure. So it's sort of funny because before I visited and before I went abroad to Sweden, I didn't really understand exactly what I looked for in friendship. And it's funny to mention that because I wasn't really able to tell the difference between people that were acquaintances and who I saw daily just because we went to the same school versus people who actually meant something, who I know would like do so much for me, who would basically die for me and I would die for them. And it was sort of funny because I wasn't able to tell that until I went to Sweden. And in Sweden, I met some of the best people that I've ever met in my entire life. And what made us meeting so interesting was that we were all from different parts of the world coming to this one small city in a not densely populated country. And we just were able to relish in that experience together and explore new things together and grow together. So, and during my time in Sweden, I actually spent so much time flying to different parts of Europe. I went to Poland, Hungary, Italy, France, you could name it, I went there. And so I sort of short-circuited my own brain because after my exchange was done and after I finished my final travel, I came back to Toronto. And in Toronto, I was thinking to myself, like, man, I was so like irritated actually because I was like, why is everything in Europe so much better, and why does Toronto suck? And like I had all this stuff in my head going on, and it wasn't Toronto's fault. And the funny thing is, I even came back during the summer, so it was the best time to be in Toronto, and I still was in this mood. But what I started to realize was that I didn't know Toronto. I didn't truly understand and know the history. And that's because when you visit other places in Europe or around the world, there's always a free walking tour. There's always a guy that's saying like, give me $10 after the tour if you think it was good, but pay what you want. And so that's one of the first things you do because you want to learn about the place that you're in. But at the time, for the 23 years that I had lived in Toronto, I actually never did like a tour. I never really looked at Toronto as being a historical city and understanding that it does have a history. So one of the first things I did when I was back was I signed up for a free walking tour. And the tour guy was great. He was showing us around, and he was showing us kind of cool things like how the old city hall existed and the history of how it was built and which architect built it. Talked about the CN Tower, a safe that I didn't know existed that was actually turned into, I believe, a restaurant that's like literally right under the Scotiabank building downtown. So all these things that I had no idea existed, he was kind of showing us. But what's funny was that during this tour, of course, I was like the only guy from Toronto there, because who from Toronto would go to a free walking tour about Toronto? It's not something you normally see. But I did. And so all the other people around me were from somewhere else. And there was this one girl, and I have to admit, when I first saw her, I was like, oh my God, she's beautiful. So my first thought was to say, like, was to talk to her, right? And she was relatively quiet, but from our conversation, I gleaned that she was a student from Austria who was staying in Toronto for 3 months because she wanted to improve her English. And so my whole thing was, okay, I'm going to go just ask her out, right? And so I asked her out, and what was funny was I don't think she took it in the way that I thought I positioned it in. And so I was thinking like it was a date, but I guess she was just thinking it's a friendly Canadian person wanting to show me around Toronto and show me what's cool here. And this wasn't a bad thing. I mean, normally you'd be like, come on, like I could have actually probably, made it more obvious. But in this case, it was a bit different because we would meet up on a weekly basis, and every week we would go to a different part of Toronto. So, for example, at one point we went to the Distillery District. What made this so interesting was like I'd gone by the Distillery District a few times, I'd been there a few times, but when you show somebody else a section of Toronto that you're so used to, and it's their first time seeing it, you're almost able to relive and re-experience the newness of the thing that you're looking at. So even with the CN Tower, when we went up to it, she was so shocked. She was like, "Oh my God, this is like the tallest thing I've ever seen in my life." And I'm thinking like, yeah, I mean, whatever, it's the CN Tower. But like hearing her excitement and sort of seeing how she saw it for the first time really made me understand like Toronto. Like if it wasn't for her, I wouldn't have, during that summer, I wouldn't have fallen in love with Toronto again. Because there's a lot of things to love about Toronto. There's a lot of good parts to the city. And you sort of take that for granted once you live here for a long time. Because, I mean, it happens with everything. You get used to things. And so I just found that interesting because she really brought that out in me. And in exchange, I was able to, I was excited. Every week we would go to a different part of Toronto. At some point it was a Toronto Island that I hadn't been to in years because I had really no reason to go. At other points it was like to the exhibition, which normally I did not like because I used to work there and I had my own beef with them. But anyway, there was a a lot of things that I was able to re-experience, and it's what I truly, it's what truly made me happy to be in Toronto for that summer again. Now, it's sort of our responsibility as well, and this is kind of how I want to conclude. Is it's our responsibility to make what we can out of a place that we live in. Because Toronto is by no means a boring city. It is a city full of life, full of wonderful people, and of course you do see that wonderfulness when the weather is better. But it truly is filled with wonderful people, and it's up to us to take advantage of that and actually go out and experience that for ourselves. And it's through things like that, through things just like showing a foreigner around the city and experiencing it through their eyes, or going to another city, understanding how they do what they do within that city, and then bringing it back to Toronto, and at the very least pitching it. And it's also about fighting against things that you don't believe in that are happening, and fighting for that crossroads we were talking about, taking that crossroads and bringing it back to a place where, in the long term, Toronto will be better. So, yeah, I just found that whole thing. I found that whole thing interesting because it really, it made me really happy. Made me really happy to be able to show somebody how I live, and for them to actually and truly be excited about it.
I mean, as tourists, it's really interesting when it's not just us seeing another city through someone else's eyes, but us getting to see our own city through another tourist's eyes as they're coming here and they're seeing the world around us. But like, I mean, it's like you say, it's really easy to take things for granted when you're there all the time and you're seeing it every day. I mean, for me, generally speaking, the CN Tower at this point is just a running destination on my morning or afternoon jog, right? But when I have family or friends come in from out of town, it's stunning to them. They want to see the tower. They want to go to the top. The glass floor alone is just a shocking, I guess, feat for them to be able to look down and see the ground all the way down. Whereas for us, it's just become a matter of course.
And you know what's funny about that is I've actually never been in the CN Tower. I've on and off for like 23 years. I'm 25, but I've been here for 23 years. And I've never actually been to the top of the CN Tower. I've never looked down. I've never, and these are the things that I mean when I talk about taking things for granted. Because when you're a tourist, your one goal is to experience all of the things in that place that would normally not be afforded to you because you wouldn't be there. But for the CN Tower, it's there all the time. Why would I have a reason to go, really? Right? So it just never really even occurred to me to try to go inside the thing and look down through that glass floor, or to do the edge walk, or to do anything like that, really. And this is when I say that it really comes down to us to be responsible about how we experience the places that we live in, because it really is our choice on whether or not we choose to enjoy a place. And of course, that of course goes up to a certain point. I think, like I was talking about with weather, I think it really has an adverse effect on people. And I think if you don't handle that properly, like for a while I've been taking vitamin D, and oh man, and then when working from home, it was draining, right? So
Absolutely.
I mean, there are some externalities that do affect you, but all in all, you have a responsibility to yourself to enjoy a place. And if you don't enjoy it, you are free to move to anywhere in the country at any time, really, right? Like, there's not really a big restriction all the time unless you have some strong ties here. And then, of course, if you work hard, you can also move to other countries and other places. So we do have the freedom. So it really comes down to just what we make of it and taking personal responsibility for our own enjoyment. For
sure. So before we close off, I mean, I think the question on everyone's mind is, what happened to the girl?
So, it's sort of funny because it did, I don't know, like it did turn romantic at a certain point, but and this is sort of the thing that I talk about that happened on my latest episode of my podcast as well. Not to plug, but we talked about the idea of short-term romance, and it was a classic case of what happened here. It was something that we both felt, but she had to leave. She had to go back to her country, and I couldn't blame her because I mean, you don't
stay. You have to stay now. You live here now.
Yeah, exactly. Like you don't do that, right? So I mean, that's basically what happened was there was a romantic twinge, I suppose, and then it fizzled out because she had to go, and that's okay because what we both got out of it was nothing short of amazing, right? Like it had nothing to. In the end, it had nothing to do with the romance and everything to do. Well, it had nothing to do with the romance between us and everything that it had to do with the romance between us and the city of Toronto. So even there, I had to give her my gratitude for helping me realize, number one, that Toronto is a great city, and number two, that it's my responsibility to enjoy where I am.
Well, hopefully if she's listening, or she listens eventually, that's something that she'll hear. So I guess the last question that I have for you, and I'm putting you on the spot a little bit here, but the last question I have for you is if you could recommend one part of Toronto, one place in Toronto to another listener on the podcast, what would that be?
One of the nicest places I like in Toronto is the trail on the Don Valley. It is one of the most beautiful walks you can ever go on, and it's so unfortunate that it's not accessible or truly accessible during the winter. Like it's just not as beautiful as you'd like it to be. But in the summer, when you walk through the Don Valley Trail and you get to see the mixture of architecture that you get to see the mixture of modern architecture and just outright wild nature. It's something that you can't really put into words, right? Like a picture says 1,000 words, literally in this case, because you have to see a picture of it to understand how beautiful it is. And then to walk down that trail and actually hike it, even more so, gives you a better feeling of what it truly is. And so I always recommend going down the trail in the DVP. And if I might be so cheeky, I just want to add one more. And it's kind of funny because I don't remember the name of it, unfortunately. But at Broadview Station, there is a field, and it has a big hill. And on that hill, you can actually see the skyline of downtown Toronto. And there was one point where I went on a date with somebody there. And we put out a blanket and we ate food and we saw kids playing baseball at the lower part of the hill. We were sitting at the upper part of the hill, just sitting and relaxing. And that skyline is one of the most romantic, beautiful things that Toronto has to offer. So you're going to have to link the name because I don't remember it, but you probably know what I'm talking about.
For sure. That's Riverdale Park, Toronto.
Thank you, Riverdale. Yes, Riverdale. Very beautiful, wonderful place to be. If you want something romantic during the summer, I would totally suggest having a picnic with your date there.
Sounds great, 100%. So that's Tatanga Small, customer experience specialist and the host of the Small World podcast, re-experiencing Toronto through a tourist's eyes. Thank you so much, Tatanga.
Thank you.
Well, that's a wrap for this premiere episode of Toronto Story Archive. Each episode, we bring on guests from Toronto to tell us a story, any story about their life in Toronto. Our commitment is to not sell, pitch, or bore you. Our goal is to amuse, excite, and at the end of the day, entertain you with stories told by the many voices Toronto has to offer. If you have a story to share, please feel free to shoot me an email to submissions@torontostoryarchive.com. My name is Waja, and thank you for tuning in to Toronto Story Archive.